So it's really the rare combination of honor and pleasure to introduce our guest speaker and filmmaker today, Dragan Kujundžić. He is a mentor, real true mentor of mine, and I have to say that I'm always telling students that you will make the most wonderful connections in the most surprising places. Of all places I met, I had the great fortune to meet Dragan under a bridge in a bat cave, basically. So just so you
True
know,
story.
Look for wonderful things in strange places, in Texas, no less. Okay, so
True story.
And
ever since then, we are in that cave.
So I think of Dragan as a mentor for two reasons. Really, the first is that in addition to giving you a list of his incredible scholarship, which has really been so foundationally multidisciplinary in across both conflict and Slavic studies, his work on theories of history and modernity, on post-colonial studies and post-structuralism, on Dragan in particular, and J. Hillis Miller, is also combined with his new work as a filmmaker. And so Dragan in many ways is really a model for me in that he, as the expression goes, spins many plates. If he'll forgive me the sort of performative image there, but he has now begun work as a filmmaker, producing scholarship in tandem with his films. The two films I would just note are The First Sale, J. Hillis Miller, which is a discussion of J. Hillis Miller's life and work. And I would highly recommend, as well as Frozen Time, Liquid Memories, in which he talks about the Holocaust and the roundup of the Jews in Novi Sad as well as Paris. And really this new work in combining film and his own scholarship, I really think is a new model for scholarly production that I find particularly exciting. And the second thing I wanted to say about Dragan is one of the things that I've always admired is the ways in which his works teach and ask questions. And he's asked us today to engage with him in dialogue, and it's his dialogic spirit in the sense that I want to celebrate. So I encourage you all to engage with his films and with us today, and with that I would like to welcome Dragan.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you. And no, give me your laptop.
Take your
Thank you. Just a second before we. We timed the talk not to be too long. I'm a big proponent of a rule: the shorter the paper, the longer the applause. But this is not the primary reason. The reason for this is that we would like to screen both films back to back, and then we will open this for discussion, okay? So I will disappear after I give this introduction, not because I don't like my film, but because, you know, filmmakers don't see many insufficiencies of their own filming. Plus, to top all of these technological problems, my iPhone died just before I came today here, so I have to go and buy a new one. But I will be a proud owner of a new iPhone when I come back after I leave for about 40 minutes. I will just open, so I will give you the introduction now and tell you a little bit about Sokurov. I did prepare a little bit. Can we turn down these lights? Or all lights? I have. Yeah, this is fine. It's fine with you. So thank you, Leah. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you everybody who put their hands to put this together. I'm really, really grateful. So this talk, what I will give you is a very short part of of a number of essays I wrote about Alexander Nikolaevich Sokurov, who is probably the greatest Russian filmmaker. When one says greatest filmmaker, one would need to know what greatest means and what filmmaking or cinema is. But let's say that I don't know of anybody, and this is any place in the world now, who has done more to integrate the reflection on cinematic image in the context of a tradition of art history. I think nobody else has given more reflection to what constitutes a cinematic image in the context of the long visual history which precedes it. And nobody else has done so much to film museums and to anchor his own filming within the museum space as he has. As you know, he's most famous for his Russian Ark, which was filmed in one take, so 81 minutes. The first large feature film filmed in Petersburg. This is just a short excerpt of an article which I wrote a year ago. When I filmed Alexander Sokurov in Land Film Studio in St. Petersburg, you will see it in my film, I was given an opportunity to see the film before it was released. So I was in the studio, I watched the film for several hours, stop and go. When I returned the film, the organizers told me, well, we did you a great favor, now you have to write for our journal, which is called the CEERES. CEERES is the first movie theater in Russia, and it's located in Land Film Studio. And they named the journal after that first cinema. So they told me, you have to write for us an essay about the film, which hasn't been released, but it will be released, so this will be just timely. I said, oh, but a great honor. CEERES publishes on Sokurov. It's a great honor for me to publish. I said, what's the deadline? And they said, in a week. So, and that is a week during which I had to, I was on a jury of an international film festival, so it's actually 3 days, because it's 4 days of jurying and 1 day of flying back home and 1 day of resting, and so it's actually 1 day to write this paper. Okay, so I didn't sleep a lot. I put my thoughts together, I wrote it, and it was immediately translated, like within a week, literally, and published in CEERES, and was subsequently also published in Diacritics at Cornell University, both the transcript and the extended version of the essay. So if you are interested in the extended version, it is in the penultimate issue of Diacritics at Cornell University. So I will tell you a little bit about Sokurov, and then we will roll the film. I can accept 1 or 2 questions, and then we roll the films, and then after the both films, I will be happy to answer more questions and talk about how I did the interview. So for the last 4 decades, the Russian filmmaker Alexander Sokurov, who was born in 1951, has moved boundaries of the cinematic image in a singular way. Outside Russia, he became famous after his single-take movie, The Russian Ark, in 2002, about the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. With a cast of thousands of extras, it was the first feature-length movie shot in one single take with a high-definition camera. The film condensed many years of Sokurov's interests in capturing museums and works of art in long takes, along with his interest in interiorizing the entire history of painting in his own cinematic image, in one form of reference or another. For example, Faust, produced in Germany and based on Goethe's Faust, and recipient of the Golden Lion Award at the 2011 Venice Film Festival, invokes paintings and the signature pictorial solutions of old Flemish and Dutch masters such as David Tenier and Hérimet de Blaise. The Russian Ark was not limited to filming the paintings. Rembrandt features prominently in the film, and you will see a little clip from the Russian Ark in my own film, however, but offered a reflection on cinema at the site of the cinematic revolution brought about by the Soviet avant-garde, Dziga Vertov, Vsevolod Pudovkin, and Sergei Eisenstein. That is, when you film in the Hermitage, which is the former winter palace, right? It's a Zimny Dvorets. That is where the revolution took place, basically. And that is the favorite site for filming of the Russian avant-garde. So when Sokurov films the entire film in one take and doesn't make a single reference to Pudovkin or Eisenstein, this is a sign to you that he wants to eliminate the entire Soviet tradition as if it didn't exist. Basically, he wants to erase it. And so this one take is an attempt to erase, to gaze at the Winter Palace intently, insistently, right? And erase everything that came before. Little ones like Eisenstein, right? Just maybe pray. And you will see he doesn't like Eisenstein, and he will tell it quite explicitly in my film. So Sokurov's film performs a colossal battle with this tradition and its ideological implications, often both politically and cinematically violent. As with many of his films, The Russian Ark raises questions about the relationship between totalitarian power and the cinematic. Moloch, film about Hitler, Taurus about Lenin, The Sun about Hirohito, and Faust, which comprise the Men of Power tetralogy. Sokurov's latest film, Francofonia, which you're about to see, produced by the Louvre and filmed in France, Sokurov now films almost entirely outside of Russia, takes up the issue of the Louvre in the middle of the World War II and the Nazi occupation of Paris. The two main protagonists are historical figures, Jacques Jaujard, the director of the Louvre during the occupation. Oops. And now I have just not to go too far. Just a second. So Jacques Jaujard, the director of the Louvre during the occupation, and Franz Wolf Metternich, the Nazi officer in charge of cataloging the works of art in the Louvre and transporting them from France to Germany. Their interaction, mutual collaboration, and political maneuvering helped save for a while, until 1942, when Wolf Metternich was recalled back to Germany for what was deemed his deliberate insufficiency, the art of the Louvre from being exported to Germany. Francofonia proposes a narrative somewhat akin to that of Schindler's List, a story of being saved from the Nazis. In this case, it is art that is saved due to the efforts of one good German and one French collaborator. The Jews are not mentioned in this film, which is quite an omission, and it caused problems to many viewers of this film. I also think it's problematic, but open to discussion. But it is also a film that thinks through the origin of all accumulation of art and the originary constitutive violence and war through which the museum is both created and threatened. Marianne, symbolizing the French Revolution, and the imperialist Napoleon are also protagonists of Francophonia. The mere enumeration of Sokurov's contributions to contemporary cinema, which he transforms with every new film, would take up many hours. Suffice it to say that he forever unsettled the boundary between the feature film and documentary with the numerous films he calls Allergies, where this borderline is at once crossed and perpetually disturbed. The same holds for Francophonia, which is at the same time a feature film, a history of the Louvre, a documentary about the Nazi occupation of Paris. You will even see Hitler saying, "And wo ist Louvre? Nach Louvre." You will see him in the film. So there is, he pulled out some very rare documentary material. And history, and so while I lost, yeah. During our, so anyway, Sokurov's preoccupation throughout all his films is the relationship between political power, this original violence of the cinematic, and the sacredness of the secret hidden behind the cinematic or any image. During a conversation on July 14, 2003 in St. Petersburg, the filmmaker told me that The Russian Ark had two false starts. The first scenes of the film staged the entrance into the palace. The time of the filming was bitterly cold, even for the St. Petersburg climate, somewhere around minus 30 degrees Celsius. The camera stalled twice upon entering the building, heated to the standard museum temperature of 21 degrees Celsius. The camera simply could not stand the abrupt shock of a temperature difference of some 50 degrees. I asked Sokurov how they resolved this and made it work for the third time, if they somehow warmed the camera up or wrapped it in some protective cover while filming outside. He answered, no, we just did this. He made the sign of a cross, and it worked. And since it's a one-take film, you can imagine once you start filming, there are 4,000 extras who start moving at the same time. So if your camera stalls, it's a big problem. You have to get everybody back in place. You have to restart and so on. So they crossed, and it worked. So today I was crossing and praying over my little cell phone, but I think that he has met his maker. The film about it didn't work. The film about the museum thus operates at the intersection between the machine and the miracle. At the moment when the camera opens up to visibility in the museum, as it leaves the frozen exterior, it freezes itself into blindness. The film, or what is then retained as the beginning of the film, indeed opens as anamnesis out of darkness or blindness, whereby the visual testimony that follows emerges from the cold. Literally, they're going from the cold into the museum. The narrator of the Russian Ark emerges from and into the darkness. I open my eyes and see nothing. I only remember that there was a catastrophe. What happened with me, I do not remember. It's one of the most beautiful beginnings in the history of cinema. Открываю глаза и ничего не вижу. I open my eyes and I see nothing, right? And there was some kind of catastrophe. That catastrophe is called, of course, for Sokurov, the Soviet Revolution. The beginning of the film thus retains in its narrative, its representation, the very trauma of the film or video production that resulted from the rapid shift in temperature, but also the film about the museum is about the entrance from the catastrophe of history into the warmth of the museum space. The film recovers, yet retains the blindness that results from the trauma of history, of the frozen exterior, which has literally, technically produced it. As the camera aperture allows for visibility, it touches the phenomenal with the blind eye. And that we will proceed, and that we will proceed to see in the Russian Ark is an effect of this perpetual blindness. The camera opens itself into a museum and onto a museum with frozen walls. Each shot thaws visibility only to freeze and register the blindness of its history. So in that sense, in Sokurov, every frame is a freeze frame. On the walls of the empty rooms of the Hermitage are empty frames, an obsessively repeated motif in Sokurov's film, in the Russian Ark, reading the blockade book, in Francofonia, a work of art substantiated by the blind eye of the lens, by the non-visible. The testimony provided by the film, what the film retains as a prosthetic gaze, borders on the miraculous. We crossed ourselves and the camera worked. In Francophonia, such a relationship between the visual and the miraculous is underscored when the revolutionary Marianne repeatedly appears in the Louvre in front of Paolo Veronese's The Wedding at Cana, one of the museum centerpieces. So this is the Louvre this summer. They did something funny. They taped on the pyramid a lifelike photograph of the Louvre. So you stand at a certain point, you superimpose, and you have this photography and the Louvre behind it. Now, of course, mine is a photography of the photography and the Louvre behind it. So there is a doubling, a tripling of the frame. But nevertheless, I chose just to show you the Louvre. There is in my film a different image. But I wanted to show you this. This won't stay forever, so this is unique. This is Veronese. And in front of this Veronese, I had to do a little bit of a research because it's a fleeting image in front of Marianne appears. And I had to do a bit of research, but it is this Veronese, the miracle in the Cana, the wedding at Cana. The Russian Ark, as well as other films of Sokurov's on museums, performs a miraculous testimony of the event, which itself remains non-visible, blind to itself. In Sokurov's museum films, the drama of testimony is as a rule represented as such, as a drama of its own impossibility. The works of art that are allowed to become visible are touched by the blind eye of the camera or systematically touched and approached by a hand. A long take of the narrator's hand in Francofonia approaching the almost transparent marble hand of a sculpture directly invokes the original miracle depicted by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, the divine touch between Adam and God. This is from Francophonia. This is narrator himself, who is, in this case, Sokurov, touching a marble statue in the Louvre. And this is, of course, the original spark, divine spark between Adam and God in the Sistine Chapel in Rome. In this regard, Sokurov shares a sensibility with so what I'm claiming is that Sokurov basically performs certain secularization of the religious image, right? Except he doesn't do it in his films. You don't see the spectacle, openly see the spectacle you would see the religious spectacle you would see in, say, Italian cinema, that you see in Pasolini, in De Sica, in you know, the latest La Grande Bellezza, right? You don't have that spectacle of Rome and the Vatican put on display. And I asked him about this, we talked about this, and he answered along these lines. I think if there is a Vatican in his filming, it is a Protestant Vatican. It is a Vatican which doesn't show itself, which concentrates on the tremendous secret of the divine presence, right? Non-representation of the divine, right? No impossibility of representing the divine, right? So this is somewhat misleading that I'm showing this example, because he will make this touch, but he will surround it without any explanation, right? There's no explanation of why and how this kind of, but it does force this kind of secularization of the sacred, right? Forces itself through without overt spectacular kind of phenomenalization or narrating or providing images related to religion, right? That is what I think is taking place in Sokurov. So in that regard, Sokurov shares a sensibility with modern and modernist art in that he perceives the emptiness of the image requiring faith to access it and facing an emptiness opened up by the image. However, this emptiness is motivated by the explicit historization of vision, by the gaze becoming historical. The gaze of Sokurov's camera is not an empty modernist aestheticization of the visual, but a close-up of the emptiness of the nihilist vision of history surrounding the image. The image opens up out of nothingness, out of the frozen catastrophe. Thus, it cannot condense into the phenomenal, visual, but always lingers on the border of the pre-phenomenal, anamnesia, contusion. It is shell-shocked, frozen, or starved by the historical context surrounding it. In Francophonia, this tension between sight and blindness is explored, touched upon, so to speak, by a repeated but always oblique, non-direct shot of one of the Louvre's most famous paintings, Théodore Géricault's The Raft of the Medusa. This is, so you see here how powerful Géricault's work is. This is the raft of the Medusa, but not a direct gaze. The image of the raft with the sailors captured in the moment of their salvation, which comes with the sighting of another ship coming to the rescue. The picture is thus that of the gaze of salvation. condenses the two regimes of blindness discussed above. One is the regime belonging to the catastrophe of history, the starving image, the ruin from which visibility emerges as an always already destroyed image, an image of a shipwreck, or image as a shipwreck. The raft of the Medusa depicts the historical event of the raft constructed after the wreck of the frigate Medusa in 1816, an event that became the emblem of the imperial ineffectiveness and catastrophe of Napoleonic ambition. Of the original 147 on the raft, only 15 survived, and they survived by eating the rest of them. The potential catastrophe that threatens art images at the beginning of Francofonia, where you see a ship carrying large containers of most precious art, right, which are at the peril of the sea. So there is this kind of threatening catastrophe looming over that ship, which might sink any moment. You will see it in Francofonia. So the potential catastrophe that threatens art images translates itself as a frozen image, the lost contact with the sinking ship, the image of disaster befalling the very capacity to see. The threat that befalls art in history and the requisition of works from the Louvre, for example, the Nazi orders to transport the Louvre art to Germany, is here explicitly underscored and anticipated by the images of the sinking ship. The museum is also, in Sokurov, an ark of salvation. It is the mainstay of the Russian Ark, and the sound of sinking ships, as well as the explicit mention of Kursk in the Russian Ark, hinting at the sinking of the submarine Kursk in the frozen depths of the Barents Sea during the early days of Putin's regime, permeate the Hermitage film. So what I'm saying is, in Sokurov, you always have this superimposition of the ship as which saves, a museum as a ship which saves art, right? But it's always on the verge of sinking, right? So there is, and it's on the verge of sinking because of the historical forces around it, right? Sokurov's Francophonia, however, offers another protocol for reading representation, which refuses direct translation and referential finitude. The museum, Francophonia suggests, is a place where art can be sheltered from the cold depths of politics, from the cold walls of history, which push through every frame or painting or film. What the museum puts on display, as does the film about the Louvre, is the non-phenomenological gift of hospitality countering historical ruination. This leads us to consider the genealogy of the singular place from which Sokurov for many years now produces his films, and I will conclude with this. It is, and I will very much appreciate your questions and discussion after both films, because I can clarify a lot of this is condensed, and I know you're hearing this for the first time. So, the context in which Sokurov produces his films is St. Petersburg, the city of the first museum in Russia, which also operated from its very foundation in a sense like a camera. It had a natural history museum called the Kunstkamera, right, of Peter the Great, which is basically like a, what you would call it, Kunstkamera, the museum, which has a room of curiosities, right? And I will show you some of them. But I'm claiming that this camera, in Kunstkamera, one can hear camera like a kino apparat or camera, film camera, right? It is a machine which basically, by means of which Russia enters into modernity. How it enters into modernity, it allows it self-reflection, it allows it, it's a space in which Russia gains its own memory, its own recording, its own archive, etc. So this is a place in which Russia enters modernity, and it's an apparatus which allows it to translate itself to itself, right? Which museums are in principle. So this is the Kunstkamera, which is the first camera in kind of Russia. So when you film in Petersburg, you already film with this kind of with this cinematic apparatus. So the Kunstkamera is indeed a place, so at the very locus of Europe, in Russia, the city and its museums as a cinematic apparatus haunt the images of Sokurov's film. It is not only that Sokurov films museums, but the very museum-like gaze of the city operating as the camera produces Sokurov's film. So he ventriloquizes, he interiorizes this cinematic quality of the city itself, and he just projects it. So Petersburg is the cinematic apparatus. The Kunstkamera is indeed a place where modernity entered Russia by means of taxidermy, mummification, and formaldehyde, but by producing age-defying exhibition objects to mark the entrance of the city and the country into historical modernity. This is St. Petersburg. I took it in 2003. You will see it in my film as well. I'm very proud of this picture. It came amazingly well. This is the Hermitage, and these are the specimen in formaldehyde. So children with two heads, Siamese twins, in the Kunstkamera. This is, I took it in May this year. These are the monstra, the monsters, right? And that was often displayed in natural history museums in the 18th century. This is curious because this is a fetus which is put in formaldehyde, and it's beautified. See, they beautified. They put a little lace on his or her head. Some of these, they are rumored to be illegitimate grandchildren of Peter the Great, whom he killed and then he put in, aborted and put in formaldehyde on display. That is for you the beauty of enlightenment, right? The gentleness of enlightenment. Right? You kill. They rumor that he decapitated. That is, he did decapitate one of the lovers of his wife, and put his head on a stake, let it rot for a couple of weeks, and then put it in formaldehyde. But it's not on display. This is more of it. But I'm showing this to you just to draw attention to, for example, a shot in Francofonia, which is a shot of a mummy. And this is a long take, about 1 minute. You will see it in the film, which is in itself the first attempt to preserve a body with various solutions, right, etc., which also should make you think about the origin of the cinematic, because film in itself is a little skin. It's pellicule, right? It's a taxiderm skin, which you pierce with light, and then you fix in a solution, right, and then you project. But this is a little skin, right? This is a skin itself, which is mummified, and then it preserves image as if it were forever self-same. And so that is the logic behind this filming. But I wanted to give you this little connection between the Kunstkamera and the Louvre. This is in the Egypt section of the Louvre. So the Kunstkamera, place where modernity entered Russia. It is also the site of the first mummification in Russia, the wax effigy of Peter the Great, a non-biodegradable replica made from his death mask by Bartolomeo Rastrelli, thus inscribing onto the very body of its founder the forces of cinema and museum that Peter the Great put into motion. So once you make that kind of city museum, everything becomes an object. Even you yourself as a maker become an exhibit. And you can see Peter the Great's wax effigy in Hermitage, and apparently it had a mechanism, and it could stand in the past and say hello and get out of here. But when they moved him from Kunstkamera to Hermitage, he fell and the mechanism broke, and they never repaired it. So I don't know if it's a myth, but that is what they say he could do. He could say hello and get out of here. Von. The museum image in Sokurov's film is thus haunted by the forces founding the city. It is a foundational hauntology, H-A-U, hauntology, spectrality which haunts Sokurov image. Sokurov's films are a seance, incidentally the names of the first cinema in Russia, located in what later became the Lenfilm studio, the seance in which I filmed Sokurov, conjuring ghosts of the Petrine modernity. Thus, the incessant modernist imperative in Sokurov's film, filming with the latest technological recording devices, often the first in the history of cinema, the revolutionary modernism of expression and preserving the image. Sokurov may be a modern-day Spinoza, a kind of vivant voyant, to use Gilles Deleuze's term about Spinoza, the one who sees and looks, right? As you know, Spinoza was a lens grinder, and he dies of silicosis because he inhaled all this glass, right? So anyway, Sokurov has original lenses ground for each new film. They grind special lenses for his signature anamorphosis, and as if always anew teaches us how to see correctly the causes of phenomenality and how to see the correct causes tout court. Sokurov teaches the ethics of seeing. He's a pedagogue and analyst of the original sense of cinema as bioscope, the gazing at life. And to conclude, but there is another element in Sokurov's film that persists in his museum's films, up to and including very prominently Francofonia. This is the frozen time of the blockade of Leningrad, which is, as you know, the Soviet name of St. Petersburg, right, during the Soviet period. A trauma lodged in the external wall of the cinematic crypt. All films by Sokurov, I would say, about museums are an attempt to escape from the brutally cold image, the permafrost of the blockade. The mummification of time, the preservation of temporality in Sokurov's cinema also takes place in the background of one of the greatest catastrophes to befall any city in modern history, the blockade of Leningrad during World War II. In Francofonia, the mummy in the Louvre is replicated a few minutes later, you will see it in Francofonia, when a frozen body wrapped in white cloth is drawn off on sleighs, while the background narrative speaks about the cannibalization of dead children that was rampant in the starved and frozen city. So yet another motif of cannibalization. In the documentary part of Francofonia dedicated to Leningrad, a sequence focuses on German soldiers' faces while the narrator repeats, "I wish this could be forgotten." So again, this anamnesis in the image is put to work. You film something and say, but I don't want to see this, right? There's an imperative, do not see. And that is the meaning also of the Medusa's head, which should petrify you, make you blind, right? You are not supposed to gaze at his films directly, right? Because it's too terrible. In this, the represented image is at once devoured or negated by the film. The anamnesis operated by the documentary at the same time wished as non-visible, non-accessible to memory, forgotten, something like an empty cinematic frame, emptied out, hollowed by the nihilistic, cannibalistic, self-consuming forces surrounding the image. Sokurov films as if to say that all Europe, civilization, museum, the Louvre, the Hermitage are empty frames. But because they are empty, they also offer the hope and the place for an unseen gaze yet to come. Nazism and Soviet communism, the black and red terror, freeze around images of sublime beauty, as if, as the voiceover says, civilization never happened, barbarism and civilization thus opening to an abyss in which they are indiscernible. No document of civilization, as Walter Benjamin famously says, is not at the same time a document of barbarism. The empty frames frequently displayed in Sokurov's films expose the nothingness of history. At the end of Francofonia, this emptiness is filled with the music of Wagner and the Soviet national anthem vying for dominance, against the background of the red screen ending the film. So, the looming catastrophe, Putinism if you want. Like the city of St. Petersburg itself, surrounded today by the Leningrad County, the name kept even after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in memory of the siege of Leningrad. The frozen walls of history envelope every image that is inscribed in Sokurov's films. That is, the image is kept within the frozen walls of this abyssal, indiscernible foundation between Europe, high culture, sublimation, and beauty, and at the same time paralyzed by the permafrost, historical, political, and ideological cannibalization and violence. The same holds true for the Louvre, which is in the jaws of wolves, while at the same time it is itself a political imperial beast, quasi-Roman and Napoleonic, or the Nazi German, uncannily symbolized by the name of the German officer in charge of pillaging the Louvre and France, Franz Wolf Metternich. He has Franz and Wolf in his name. The devouring maw of the sovereign. In Sokurov's films, every frame is a freeze frame. His films are an attempt to thaw the image from the layers and deposits of this violence. And this is my last paragraph. This is, for example, how his documentary Reading the Blockade book ends. And blockade is the siege of Leningrad. After 2 hours of reading by participants from all walks of life, diverse in gender and age, they read testimonies of hunger, starvation, and freezing during the siege of Leningrad. The film ends with a long take on the contemporary Hermitage with searchlights penetrating the winter night. And this resembles Sokurov's own experience of the Hermitage, in which he has been thawing from the external cold ever since his first visit. He will tell you about this first visit. He said, first time I went to Hermitage, it was very cold outside. I went inside and I thawed. Right? I warmed up and I thawed. He will say that. My claim is that he has stayed there and left ever since. The permafrost and the museum thus frame the narrative about the blockade of the Nazi occupation of Paris and pillaging the art in the Louvre in Francofonia, which in turn framed the image of the museum. Thus, the energetic core of Sokurov's filming of the museum, and probably of all his films, carries the trace of this constitution and destruction of the image, peeling off of representation, attempting, as it were, to defrost and thaw the freezing political and historical walls gripping the filmic image. Francophonia is Sokurov's latest attempt to thaw the frozen image, the freeze frame, which the film desperately tries to forget and escape. Thank you. Well, this is too horrible to applaud to, yes. Yeah, it ain't funny. It ain't, you know, it's not a funny cinema. So let's now roll my own film.
Do you want to do the film and then do questions?
Do you have any questions? Let's say I have a brief few questions to clarify anything that with which might have been left too confusing for you. Before I will just briefly tell you what happened. Well, I told you already where this was filmed, so, and the film should speak for itself. Do you have any questions about my presentation, or? Yeah, please.
Oh, a brief question. I feel like actually everything you said about the aesthetics seems to be so deeply steeped in the ontology of the cinematic image of Bazin, even this Mavi complex.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious in this context, what is the relation to the digital?
Yeah, you will hear that in his. I asked him. Okay. Well, he feels that this is a threat to basically to all our perception of art. You know, he believes in the aura of art. He's in that sense of auracity, right? On this kind of great sublime of art. So he thinks that even cinema already violates that. Actually, cinema is a machine which devours art for its own purposes, right? It is a dominant kind of massive machine, technological machine, which devours the artistic sublime. But digital goes even further. It's a kind of universal global flattening, which makes images available, readily available, right? Cheapens them, right? There's a. However, he uses digital, and actually I asked him, this is the first film in which you can see the computer. He uses the digital computer. There is electromagnetic band, sound band, soundtrack projected on the film, and so on. So he uses it. The film opens with the actually internet connection, Skype, and so on. So it's very much, you know, media-oriented film. I mean, he employs it, but regrets it at the same time, right? As for Bazin, yes, I asked him about Bazin. The great minds think alike. Thank you. Yes, I asked him about Bazin. That was my idea. That when you film obsessively this kind of the surface of a mummy, you know, you cannot but start thinking, okay, you're filming the film, right? You want to tell us, okay, this is what I'm doing. I'm filming the film while Nazi officers knocking on a sarcophagus, right? On a glass sarcophagus, right? So this is, you know, the scene which he sets up, right? So that is there is this kind of, yeah. But I think he is he has read his Bazin. Yeah, but he will tell you more. I leave you his answers to the film. Yeah, but I'm answering to what I wrote in my paper. Yes, indeed, I wrote about Bazin in my own paper in this regard. Yeah. Any other question? Please. No? Oh, Ilya. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to follow up on the Bazin question. And if from that essay Bazin, right? So like to save being from the appearance of being. What is he, or what are you suggesting that is being saved then?
Well, he would say it's the sacredness of the body. This kind of. I think it saves the secret because he filmed something which is actually hidden from the gaze, ideally. Because when do you have the mummy exposed? That comes with the Enlightenment and modernism, when they actually managed to preserve the mummy outside of the vacuum in which it was placed in the first place, right? So you have this exposure. It's a violence done to what is meant to be preserved and hidden from the gaze. These mummies were not supposed to be exposed. In that sense, there's an interesting also analogy with Lenin's body. And you know, so we can think of here some kind of commentary on Lenin's body, which is actually an exposed mummy, right? Without even wrapping, right? It's a direct exposure. I actually wrote a chapter about this, as you know, in my Returns of History. So what he wants to preserve the secret behind the image, right? So he would say this is actually he films it incessantly, but he seeks to recapture the secret behind the image that was at the origin of this form, I would say. Whether it is the sacredness of the image which is behind, which I think it is for him some kind of cinematic techno-messianism, but of a Protestant kind, which doesn't want to show itself, like the Dead Christ in the Tomb by Hans Holbein, right? Who films Dead Christ in a tomb, right? Not revealed, not even in the crypt, right? So that is the type of secret, I think, that Sokurov saying. Or you can say simply the secrecy of the image, which cannot be relieved. Try as you might, you know, against all the attempts to open it up by the camera gaze, which is the most revelatory, right, machine there is, right? This is, you put a camera, everything is revealed, right? Nothing can be secret. People start talking immediately, like myself. They own up anything, they confess. You know, that's a machine of confessional machine of revelation, right? However, Sokurov is terrified by it. He shows you obsessively a secret behind the image by means of the cinematic. Thus a great conflict, rhetorical. It's like if you think Paul de Man, one rhetorical regime destroys the other. His grammar destroys his rhetoric, right? They're at odds constantly, right? Without conciliation. He shows you that this is impossible to see. I am blind. I'm showing you, I'm touching, like a camera is blind touch of the image. And that is why he films blind people touching art in the Russian Ark, or films within Hermitage, which has the largest collection of, you know, Tobiah with an angel of images, some classical imagery of the blindness, healing the blind man of Jericho, and so on, in the Hermitage, right, which are glanced at in the Russian Ark, is the motif that he, I would say, tries to kind of narrate. That's the kind of energy, right? You want to show the secret of the image, and so you have him, for example, in the elegy of the Elegia Darogi. So this is some kind of somnambulic trip. You don't know what is happening. All of a sudden, he's in a museum in Brussels. Empty frames, cold, the museum is closed. He comes to the image of a church, and he reaches with a hand and then stops. And then the museum ends on the word nothingness. So you have it. So this kind of secret behind the image and this kind of insensate gaze on what is behind the image also borders on certain nihilism and maybe death of God. I don't know. You can make many interpretive directions, you know, if you were to choose, right? But so that's why I'm saying it is not the Vatican, it is not the Catholic revelatory global revelation, right, of Catholicism that is filmed in Rome by everybody who has filmed in Rome, from Fellini, Pasolini, right, De Sica, everybody films, and it's a revelatory machine, right? No, not that. On the contrary, it's a secret behind it. It's this kind of the image which refuses to reveal its own secret. Okay, on that happy note, I don't want to, or unhappy maybe, yeah. We will roll this. So what you will see is Sokurov exactly a year ago in Petersburg.